Indonesia was presented at UGM, as scholars of UGM collaborated with Dutch scholars in this huge project in which I think about more than 20 books have been brought out. Yet we heard this team of Indonesian and Dutch researchers who carried out this project explain to the audience that there is so much more to investigate with respect to the actual workings or mechanisms of colonialism. Mechanisms of colonialism are still globally present and cannot be discarded as something of the past. Now, in our project, we focus on questions which help us understand those mechanisms. How did colonialism actually work on the ground? Through what policies and practices focused on children and their families? Can I see the next one, please? Now, in our project, we focus on questions which help. Oh, I hear myself. There is an echo in the Zoom. I hope that doesn't bother you. So Furpo and Jacobs, whom I just mentioned, argue that intimate colonialism or soft colonialism is closely connected to the politics of benevolence in colonies as well as in metropoles. So say in Europe as well as in South Asia or in Africa or South America. I hope that does. And main actors, so Furpo and Jacobs, whom I now hear it like it gets a bit disturbing. Yeah, I know, but is it possible to turn down the volume just a little bit so that I don't hear the echo? Very disconcerting. Thank you. Makasih banyak. So intimate colonialism is closely connected to the politics of benevolence. Main actors were missionaries, humanitarian reformers, government officials who shrouded these politics of benevolence in narratives of rescue. With respect to colonial and post-colonial Indonesia, we find such narratives mostly printed and published sources, not only of Christian missionaries, humanitarian reformers, and government officials, but also in similar sources that are kept by Islamic charities, Muhammadiyah in particular, that identified care for the poor, for poor, abandoned, and orphaned Indonesian children as one of its main charitable activities. So education, children's upbringing, their welfare, their health were at the heart of soft colonialism that shaped late colonial society. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Dutch government operated on the principle of the so-called ethical policy to give something back to the Dutch East Indies, which we had robbed from so much. So we wanted to give something back. So I say as a Dutch person, but actually I'm a bit ambivalent as I have Indonesian roots. My father was born in Bandung, and his side of the family is Indonesian, is Javanese, and that goes back a long way. So if I say we, I mean Belanda, but actually I'm sort of a combination of Belanda and Indonesian. Anyhow, at the heart, so this ethical policy mobilized money and manpower in the direction of the Dutch East Indies. The Dutch considered it their obligation and mission to help and civilize colonized peoples. Colonial authorities outsourced this civilizing mission to faith-based organizations. And initially, Protestant and Catholic organizations were able to meet the requirements for government funding for their schools, their orphanages, and other institutes of children's upbringing. But since the 1920s, this applied to Muhammadiyah as well. They also got funds from the colonial government to run their schools, to run their orphanages. So they are implicated in this colonial system of child welfare and children's upbringing, with specific attention to the children who were deemed neglected, abandoned, or orphaned. And if you hear me say deemed, abandoned, neglected, and orphaned. So narratives of rescue, on the one hand, identify which children were considered in need to be rescued. So what children do we need to rescue? But these narratives, on the other hand, indicate also what these children needed to be rescued from and from whom these children needed to be rescued from. So rescue is not just an autonomous or a general thing, but it is a narrative, it's a discourse, and we need to find out which children were identified to be in need or at risk, and what then was precise the risk they were exposed to. Often such narratives of rescue revolve around a disqualification of local birth mothers as being unfit to raise their children. In the Dutch East Indies, Eurasian children came to be looked upon as a group that could potentially undermine Dutch colonial rule. Although these children were of Dutch descent because of their father, they challenged European standards of living and social comportment, social and cultural comportment, so it was thought. And they challenged these because they were cared for by their Indonesian mothers in a kampong or in a desa. And that colonial administrators thought was not befitting for children with a Dutch father. Such conditions did in no way match the standards set for the education of children who were considered to be members of a European minority, which considered itself morally superior to local groups and therefore fit to rule. We have a very complex story here about this rescue. You rescue children from their mothers and from an upbringing in the Desa because you want to keep up the Dutch colonial rule, and that Dutch colonial rule relies on a very small minority of Dutch people in Indonesia who can only rule if they discursively and culturally, etc., distinguish themselves from the millions and millions and millions of Indonesians. All right, can we see the next one, please? So for this project, we adopt a social cultural approach of colonialism, and we focus on constructions and meanings of difference in colonial society. And we concentrate on entanglements between colonial administration and faith-based organizations, because don't be fooled by what a Catholic order of priests or sisters say about that they're not political, that they are no political organizations. And similar narrative we find with Muhammadiyah. No, we're not a political organization. But actually, the upbringing of children and grooming them into their position, the position they are supposed to take in colonial society, that is a political action. So this whole thing about soft colonialism, child removal, it has deep, deep, deep political roots and political meanings and consequences. An analysis of these education projects allows us to assess policies and practices and how these worked, how they constituted differences, how they created boundaries and hierarchies in colonial society. So the project not only addresses soft colonialisms, but intimacies of empire as well. And here I would really like to acknowledge the pioneering work done by Anne-Laure Stoler on the pivotal role of gender and family relations in colonizing and civilizing projects in the Dutch East Indies. Now, Stoler pointed at the regulation of sexual practices and gender relations as key to colonial power relations. Such intimacies of empire solidified in this soft colonial rule that was entangled, always entangled and connected to the hard and at times also very violent colonial rule. Stoler concentrated specifically on discourse, and in this project, we turn our attention to policies and also to practices in order to investigate how difference were constituted and maintained on the ground. What we know so far relates to Christian missionary discourses and practices of rescuing children, and these discourses reduced differences, and these differences supported colonial mechanisms of control. And as such, these differences were integral to colonial governmentality, enabling colonial authorities to impose power on the subject. Can you hit the button a couple of times because there are more dots on the screen? Sorry that I cannot ask this in Bahasa. I think now we have everything. Yeah, wonderful. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So such colonial mechanisms of control were integral to colonial governmentality, enabling colonial authorities to impose power on its subjects. Because of such deep entanglement, oh no, let's skip this part, sorry. Gonna save some time. So by investigating colonial childhoods, we aim to trace how racial and social hierarchies have been formed and transformed, and by whom, in modern colonial projects or colonial projects that were deemed modern, the education of children, institutional care for children, colonial projects to which faith-based organizations were party. They were central to carrying these projects, carry out these projects. Can we see the next one, please? And you can hit the button again so that we see everything, yeah. By now you may understand that we as a research team do not use child separation as a given. Instead, we aim to conceptualize this concept in the context of colonial and post-colonial Indonesia. Whereas we assume that child separation was and remained a colonizing practice, we acknowledge that this practice was implemented in different ways. Earlier, you heard me use the term or concept child removal, forced removal of children from their birth parents, next of kin and community in Canada, Australia, and North America. Now, in our project, we prefer the term child separation, as this allows for a more systematic investigation of such premeditated and forced removal, as well as for a range of other situations in which children were separated from their personal and familial environment. So we are concentrating on a larger variety of child separation, both in colonial and post-colonial Indonesia. Besides forcible and permanent removal and appropriation, child separation may also involve manumission from enslavement, subsequent fostering, discursive, legal, and actual orphaning or dekinning children, forced and consensual stay at orphanages and boarding schools, consent coerced. And we've now in the summer school that we just conducted seen how a location-based approach helps us to conceptualize, to fill this concept with meaning. So it's an empirical research that is driven by a concept, but the concept isn't a given. Concept is developed out of the empirical research. And to be sure, and that this is important, children are not and have never been a historically or culturally stable category. In colonial Indonesian, colonial authorities, in unison with Christian faith-based actors in the emerging field of social welfare, imposed universal Western notion of what a child is and what a child needs. But such conceptions largely ignored local Indonesian, Eurasian conceptions of children, as well as arrangements designed for their care. And we hope to find out to what extent such notions, which were embraced and perhaps what these notions were, and whether they got also connected or modified by the contacts with European faith-based organizations. Okay, wait a minute, I can do this too. Yeah, we're going to see this one. Otherwise, the chairman will be unhappy. As I said before, faith-based initiatives and institutions in that arose, that were born in colonial Indonesia, have been incorporated in the education and child welfare system of post-colonial Indonesia. And you see here a wonderful example that I was able to visit last year. Vincius Kramat in Jakarta, which was established at the end of the 19th century. It still exists to this day, and it has seen many carriers, many different groups of children. So these kind of locations, these kind of institutions help us understand the development and changes, continuities and discontinuities over a longer period of such institutions of faith-based upbringing, education of children. I'll tell you a little bit about the impact, and let's see, does this work? No, I should do it like this. No, I should do it. Yeah. What we hope to achieve with our project is to draw attention to the significance of soft colonialism for understanding the Dutch and Indonesian colonial past, its post-colonial continuities, and its lasting impact on the Netherlands and Indonesia. We do this with a specific attention to those who were raised in faith-based institutions, separate from their family and community. And we do it with specific attention to the descendants of such former pupils of institutional care who now, or for a longer period of time, have to deal with broken family ties because their ancestors were taken out of families or were brought to orphanages to be raised there. So many families, specifically Eurasian families, Indo-European families, Indo-Chinese families, have broken family time gaps and silences in family histories because not much is known about the period that their ancestor grew up in an institution. Yeah. Can we see the next one, please? Right. We would like to find out the scale and the significance of faith-based out-of-home care, but I have to admit we're baffled by the complexity of the archival research. So we don't know whether we can honor this objective of our project. What we will do is we will create an open web resource of institutes and initiatives in the Netherlands catered for the Dutch Eurasian community diaspora. And we're trying in Citizen Science Project to get a conversation going between what we as historians find in many archival collections, from state archives to personal archives, with memories and stories of people themselves, family history, etc. And we brought out the website Colonial Children Connected. Can I see this one, please? Oh, probably I did this. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's the one. Thank you. We built this website in a previous project, and it focuses on microhistories or life stories of children, in which we portray children as historical actors for now, and we welcome contributions to this website. We also include stories of adoption and transnational child displacement, and we hope that with the references to archival collections and oral history resources and other references that we build up a source base of such life stories of children who grew up separate from their family, kin, and community. So if you have the time, you can take a look with the organizers how we're going to make the link available. The next one's already on. That is just brief, just very brief. In 2021, you see me on the left. This is a very blurry picture with my colleagues Marleen Reichelt and Maaike Derksen. And Maaike Derksen now is a postdoc in this project. we developed a project, Saving Children, Kinderen, which aims to explain how a colonial society in the Dutch Empire, the Dutch East Indies, how that actually functions, what colonial practices related to education, and how these shaped and reshaped and also broke up local society and kinship structures. And we try to connect that to the here and now, and we do that for an audience of children in elementary schools at the ages of 10 till 12. And we try to connect it to their here and now. For instance, Dutch children are in the habit of contributing small amounts of money each week for the education of a child, so-called underprivileged child, say in South America or in Africa. And we, in the project and through this project, children came to understand on a very small scale that charitable intentions and activities contributed to shaping hierarchical relations between the donors and the recipients. So one of the questions we put to the children was like, oh, are you then going to ask the child to whom you're giving something what she would like to give to you? Maybe she has a story, maybe she can send a letter, maybe she wants to make a drawing. In other words, make this more a reciprocal relationship instead of a hierarchical relationship with European donor children and a South American or an African recipient. All right, I'm gonna move up. We have brought out a chapter, but more importantly, there is a whole set of archival materials, questions, etc., by which children in elementary school from the ages of 10 to 12, but even children in secondary school find this very relative, can do investigative learning. They can learn on a very small scale do archival research, and the research is focused on one orphanage and on sources related to that orphanage. So the intention is of this whole project is get scientific breakthroughs into the classroom. So don't let us scholars sit in an ivory tower and just speak at wonderful conferences like this, but let's think about how we can tweak our results of big projects on a small scale for children in elementary school to get them interested, to get them to do research, a very small scale, and in that way contribute to helping to shape a future generation of critically formed scholars. I think this is it. And I want to thank you very much for your attention. Oh, we need to, sorry, we need to scoot over. Yeah, this is the project. This is a series of books, but there is also the link that's you to the entire project with the materials. And of course, I apologize, it's in Dutch, but there is not much material on colonial history for children in primary education. So this is one of the few modules, and it's also a module that is assessed to be fit for for children in secondary education. So it's a lot of fun to do this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof. Montero. It's very interesting. The topic is explaining about, we call it soft colonialism. That is the way. The colonial past is not only related with the war, with the soldiers, with the politicians, but also involve just like people in the society, from the white people of Dutch in Indonesia in the past, who running the orphanage and all college child inspiration project. Okay, let's move to Ismail Fajri Alatas. Yes.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidina Rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Marit, that was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. I learned a lot, truly. It's really great. So thank you for that presentation. And let me first thank the organizer of the conference for the kind invitation. It's an honor to be here. I would like to thank Bu Roma, Mbak Yuyun, Mbak Eka, for the opportunity and for the invitation. By the way, is the slide here? Okay, good. Is this working? Oh yeah, okay, good. All right, and I want to congratulate the organizer for coming up with a very intriguing and interesting topic, conceptually very interesting. I was reading, as I was thinking about what to present for this conference, I was reading the conference description, and at the end of the conference description, the organizers write that, quote, to understand, question, and build future historical alternatives grounded in substantial equality between the East and the West, the South and the North, non-binary, non-linear efforts are needed, end quote. I found this to be quite intriguing, and it is to this challenge that I want to devote my talk. That is, I want to think about the problems of history and historicity, particularly the problem of linearity and binaries, and explore ways of thinking about history founded on alternative conception and imagination of temporality. So what I will deliver today is an exercise in thinking. Of course, it is something that engages several important works that deal with the problem of historical time and envisage alternative modes for the production of historical knowledge. And of course, as an exercise of thinking, it's going to be rough, patchy, crude. So please bear with me and let's try to think together. And I want to start with the anthropologist, Claude Lévi-Strauss. In the last chapter of La Pensée Sauvage, or The Savage Mind, the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss launches a critique of Jean-Paul Sartre's Critique de la raison dialectique. At the heart, are you guys done? Are you done? Thank you. At the heart of this critique is Lévi-Strauss's objection to Sartre's championing of history as the ontological ground by which human existence develops. That is, Sartre's positioning of dialectics as an iteration of the process by which humans constitute history while simultaneously being constituted by history. Such a postulate, Lévi-Strauss argues, presents, quote, not a concrete image of history, but an abstract schema of men making history of such a kind that it can manifest itself in the trend of their lives as a synchronic totality. What can one make of people without history? The eminent anthropologist inquires, when Sartre has defined humans in terms of dialectic and dialectic in terms of history. Sartre's inclination to locate humans in a single historical mode of being is for Lévi-Strauss an expression not only of egocentricity and naivety, but also of Eurocentrism. While Sartre invoked historical consciousness as what distinguished the primitive and the civilized, yet he himself falls into the trap of ahistoricity. That is, by positioning history as the ground of human existence, history becomes a mythical entity, a reality outside of time. It is this reification of a singular time and temporal trajectory, a historical time, to secure the universality of history that Lévi-Strauss found to be most problematic. If certain events are considered as historical facts, how about other occurrences? Where did they take place? If one says that a historical event took place in history, should one be obliged to say that every physical and psychical movement is also historical by virtue of taking place in history. When one talks about the French Revolution as a historical fact, for example, what is the French Revolution if not a multitude of hundreds, if not thousands of different events that only takes a unified shape in through a historian's retrospective glance? Historians carve and shape history from an infinite strand of occurrences, including some while excluding others. In formulating narrative and meaning, history is forever obliged to select events, regions, periods, and groups of people. In this sense, history is never history, but always history for. And although subjectivity of history for me can make for the objectivity of a history for us, or shall we say temporal singularities transforming into a temporal particularity, the I can only be converted into we by condemning this we to being no more than an I raised to the power of the two, itself hermetically sealed off from other we's. In other words, history for us will always be a history for me, elevated to a preconceived superiority. The rest shall remain as people without history, and the only way of incorporating them into history is precisely by subjecting them as auxiliaries or subsidiaries in a history not of their own making. So what Frantz Fanon once wrote seems to resonate well here. Fanon once said, quote, "For the black man, there is only one destiny, and it is white." Not only in the sense that historical time presupposes a singular future, but also because history for me is crucial in creating the me, as only through history that the me can be instantiated. Otherwise, the cogito would degenerate into a series of discontinuous enunciations of the I's without ever becoming me. Thus, the white me, or the Occident, only stabilizes in through a singular historical plane that includes the black or brown others, or the Orient, positioned in their subsidiary or auxiliary role. And here lies one of the central paradoxes of the transcendental subject. It goes back all the way to Hegel, in that its own transcendence is only realizable through its instantiation in a spatial-temporal confinement that enables its potentials to experience the world and to define itself in terms of others. Hence the whole binaries problem, right? So Lévi-Strauss has highlighted one of the fundamental problems with history as an ontological construct, a temporal construct that is somehow understandable through a particular mode of inquiry. Decades before the postmodern onslaught on history and the reactionary defenses of the discipline, Lévi-Strauss has prefigured some of the questions that more recently are addressed more thoroughly than historians. One of these historians is Dipesh Chakrabarty, whose book, Provincializing Europe, attempts to engage with the problem of historicism. By historicism, Chakrabarty means, quote, the idea that to understand anything, it has to be seen both as a unity and in its historical development. Jadi semua singularitas itu harus dimaknai dalam sebuah kesatuan, sebuah totalitas, dan dalam sebuah continuum atau development waktu. Or to use Lévi-Strauss's term, everything ought to be located in a history for us, that in reality is just a history for me. Chakrabarty begins with an observation of the impossibility of understanding the phenomenon of political modernity everywhere without invoking certain categories and concepts that originated in the course of the European Enlightenment in the 19th century. Kita bicara Indonesia saja sebagai post-colonial country. Kita tidak bisa bicara Indonesia tanpa keluar dari konsep negara yang negara modern yang pertama di-develop di Eropa post-Westphalian. Kan? Kita nggak bisa keluar dari situ. These concepts in turn entail an unavoidable and indispensable universal and secular vision of the human. Chakrabarty argues that it is historicism that made modernity look not simply global, but rather as something that became global over time, originating in one place, spreading beyond, subsuming others. In this sense, historicism projects a structure of global historical time informed by the logic of first in Europe, then elsewhere, in which the elsewhere, like the Orient, is situated in the waiting room of history. Historicism, however, remains a feeble ideological construct. Democratic post-colonial countries like India, for instance, shattered the waiting room logic of historicism. On the one hand, India is supposed to wait while historical time of development and civilization elapses before they could be like Europe. On the other hand, the general election that happen every 5 years, when illiterate and literate citizens are suddenly bestowed the power to shape the future of politics, smashes the logic of historicism by the spectacular performative of the now. Mass democracy seems to temporarily suspend historical time. This led Chakrabarty to question the assumption that human exists in a frame of a single and secular historical time that somehow envelops other kind of time. His projects attempt to think about historical difference by first demystifying ideologies that originate in Europe that have been accepted as given through analytic endeavor, and secondly, by phenomenologically charting different histories of belonging, variegated life worlds, and different modes of being in time, or to use the Heideggerian term, historicality, as opposed to historicity. One clear example of this project can be seen in Chakrabarty's reading of Marx's Capital. In the reproduction of its own life, Capital has to encounter relationships that present double possibilities. Money, for example, which is central to Capital, does not necessarily belong by any natural connection to Capital's own life process. Marx recognizes the possibility that money as relations could have existed in history without necessarily giving rise to capital. Kalau duit saya timbun aja di dalam rumah, dia tidak akan bisa mereproduksi waktunya kapital, ya kan? Makanya that's why hoarding, menimbun uang di rumah itu sangat membahayakan untuk the livelihood of kapitalisme. Anda ingat waktu kejadian-kejadian krisis WTC dan lain-lain, tiba-tiba orang tidak ada yang spending, government panik, ayo keluar, beli, harus tetap jalan ini roda kapitalisme ini. So Marx recognizes the possibility that money as relations could have existed in history without necessarily giving rise to capital. Such a heterogeneity that Marx read into the history of money demonstrates that relations that do not contribute to the reproduction of capital can be intimately intertwined and coexist with relations that do. The same also applies to the category of abstract labor that capital needs to construe in order to mask the dehumanizing project of human labor. Yet abstract labor could never fully domesticate the concrete life of the laborers, their bodies, nerves, and muscles that in themselves become a locus of different temporality that can be independent of, but coexisting with the time of capitalism. The transition from concrete to abstract is therefore a question of translation from incommensurable temporalities to the homogeneous time of abstract labor, or to use the Heideggerian term, the translation from historicality to history. Nevertheless, and this is Chakrabarty's point, the money and body not used to reproduce capital foreground multiple ways of being in time, one that coexists with, but not reducible to the time of capitalism. And here lies the possibility of envisioning multiple temporalities coexisting with what has become the dominant time. Even when subsumed under the homogeneous sign of history, these heterogeneous temporalities remain, albeit as a Derridian trace, that is, as something which cannot be fully enclosed and constantly challenged from within history's claim to unity and universality. Chakrabarty's project of provincializing Europe seeks to hold in a state of permanent tension a dialogue between the indispensable and universal history of capital and the diverse ways of being human and being in time, by enabling the possibility of constant modification and interruption of the totalizing thrust of historical time. Note, however, that Chakrabarty found alternatives in the phenomenological, in alternative forms of human sociality and belonging that, unlike history, remain somewhat unstable. Salah satu contohnya ya waktu warung kopi. Kalau Anda duduk-duduk di warung kopi itu waktunya itu beda waktu yang dominan itu. Itu waktunya sangat dinamis, sangat tidak bisa di measure dan lain-lain. Nah, itu Chakrabarty tertarik dengan hal seperti itu. Bentuk-bentuk waktu dalam kehidupan manusia yang sangat berbeda dengan konsepsi waktu yang historical time tadi. They are unstable though, because they cannot be divorced from the intersubjective relations that engendered them. In contrast, what makes historical time stable and perceivable as seemingly objective is the discipline of history. The writing of history, historical education, gives shape and form to historical time. So to become more stable, alternative temporalities need to be inscribed and narrativized in a way that do not sacrifice them to historical time. For that, we need to explore alternative historiographical operation. That, I think, is the challenge if we are to think about time and futurity beyond linearity and binary construction of the Occident and the Orient. The preliminary attempt to take up this challenge, I want to now turn to two alternative historiographical operations that can be described as perhaps poetic and the prophetic. To do this, I want to turn to two kinds of figure that instantiated these historiographical operations, the poetic and the prophetic. That is the figure of the flaneur and the figure of the pujongo. So, and the Occidental figure of the flaneur and the Oriental figure of the pujongo. So let me start with the flaneur, the figure of the dandy, modern, urban stroller discussed by the 19th century French poet Charles Baudelaire, whose oeuvre has been studied most interestingly by the philosopher and literary critic Walter Benjamin. What is particularly important about the flaneur is his foregrounding of the now as the present pregnant with multiple temporal possibilities through his encounter with multiple commodities and passerby. What constitutes this now is intersubjective. That is, it is the relation between flaneur and the various commodities he encountered in the streets or in the Parisian arcades. Ini flaneur ini kan seorang dandy yang udah cukup duitnya, dia nggak perlu kerja keras. Akhirnya setiap siang dia pergi aja tuh keliling-keliling kota Paris, nggak ada tujuan. Jadi dia jalannya itu sangat pelan, strolling, melaku-melaku kalau orang Jawa bilang. Dia liatin semua hal-hal itu, dia bisa fokus karena dia jalan di kota itu menuju dari poin A ke poin B, tapi memang dia jalan for the sake of jalan, dia jalan-jalan aja ngeliat-liat gitu. Komoditas-komoditas yang ada, reklame-reklame dan lain-lain. As the flaneur was bombarded by various things he aimlessly encountered, his subjectivity is constantly reconfigured through these variegated engagements. As he relaxedly strolled through the urban space, he began to see endless singularities, whether in the form of commodity, facade, architectural motifs, or in the form of different people who constantly passed him. Through those encounters, the flaneur realized the sheer heterogeneity of time. Karena dia sendiri, dia berjalan dengan waktunya sendiri. Maka dia lihat ke sana, ada dua orang lagi pacaran dengan waktunya sendiri. Dia lihat ke sana, ada orang lagi baking roti, lagi bikin roti dengan waktunya sendiri. Dia ngeliat ke sana, dia lihat burung-burung dengan waktunya sendiri dan lain. Jadi ternyata, aduh, dunia ini penuh dengan keragaman waktu karena dianya sendiri nggak cepat jalan dari satu poin ke poin lain. At the same time, those singularities that he encountered are somewhat connected, not in and of themselves, but in and through him, thereby producing a vision of spatio-temporal particularity made up of those similarities. And yet this experience of the present depends on the synthesizing capacity of consciousness, That is, its ability to organize, unite the experience of the everyday. But this consciousness was constantly dislocated by the constant bombardment of changing forms that mark modern urban experience. In other words, the urban everyday poses a continuous challenge to the synthesizing capacity of consciousness. The variegated commodities and passerby constantly shock the flaneur, making his self-awareness all the more alert. Experience made him realize that the assemblages of commodities and people work to give the illusion of spatio-temporal totality while undermining it at the same time. The constant shocks and surprises experienced by the flaneur undermines that very totality. And in this sense, the experience of the flaneur constitutes a particular space-time and deconstituted at the same time, thereby throwing into sharp relief the very artificiality of any spatio-temporal construct. This very dynamic is elegantly captured in Baudelaire's lyric poetry. And this is what fascinated Benjamin. Baudelaire's poetry projects the city as a unified urban experience, while simultaneously pointing to its very existence as an amorphous assemblage of irreducible things and passerby. Capturing this dynamic was indeed Baudelaire's poetic aspiration. Thus, in a letter to the editor-in-chief of La Presse, Baudelaire writes, quote, "Who among us has not dreamt in his ambitious days of the miracle of a poetic prose? It would have to be musical without rhythm and rhyme, supple and resistant enough to adapt itself to the lyrical stirrings of the soul, the wave of motion of dreaming, the shocks of consciousness. This ideal, which can turn into an idée fixe, will greet especially those who are at home in the giant cities and the web of their numberless interconnecting relationships." To be musical without rhythm and rhyme. To be musical without rhythm and rhyme. I found it fascinating. Here, dialectic, I think, is no longer defined in terms of history as in Sartre. Instead, it is a dialectic of seeing that happens in the now of the present through the gaze of the poet, who can see the making and unmaking, the formation and deformation of a temporal space, a particularity. Baudelaire's poetic model inspired Benjamin to conceive his own historiographic approach, a praxis of history that he calls materialistic historiography. Instead of establishing causal connection between various moments in history, the materialist historian, like the flaneur and the lyrical poet, begins with the now of recognizability. The task of the material historian is to save that very now from being captured by the continuity of history and tame into mere succession. For that reason, the materialist approach is one that emphasizes construction rather than reconstruction. Reconstruction, in Benjamin's view, already presupposes a present that is continuous with the past. Materialist method, in contrast, arrests the now and grasps the constellation between the now and a certain past that correlates with it, a past that is always in danger of receding into oblivion. In doing, the materialist historian blasts the continuum of history. Indeed, Benjamin dismisses the historicist conception of continuous progress as a fiction that obeys the logic of capitalism, that stresses the quick receding of the past into the background as it is being replaced by something new. And that always happens. Right? Selalu ada yang baru kalau dalam kapitalisme. For Benjamin, the actuality of the present ought to be the primary and privileged temporality against which all other moments would be measured. The materialist historians see the singularities of humans, objects, and things as signs waiting to be actualized in different temporal configuration. And that historical construction ought to be informed by politics. That is, by the politics of making manifest what has been as an image that correlates with the present. In Benjamin, dialectic became a category that does not have to fall into a linear time. Instead, it's temporality that has to become dependent on the dialectic of seeing if it is to be freed from abstractness or any preconceived notion of totality. Benjamin's look at the space of trivialities where after images or traces of what once had been can be actualized again in different temporal configuration to suggest alternative future. And that's the point, is to suggest alternative future, which can only be properly pursued once historical time is no longer treated as an objective ontological reality, but as an artifice of historiography and of narrativity. Ladies and gentlemen, Benjamin's notion of materialist historiography as a constructive exercise may stand in stark contrast to the dominant post-Enlightenment conception of historiography as a scientific recovery or recuperation of the past as what really happened in transparent representational language. But that act of recuperating and activating multiple temporalities would not sound too strange to another poetic figure, this time from the Orient, that of the Javanese Pujongo, whose prophetic historiography has been studied quite extensively by Nancy Flores. A Pujongo is all at once a poet, prophet, spinner of tales, master of time reckoning, and historian. To be a Pujongo is to be a master of language with a prophetic pen. One of the great examples of this is, of course, Rongo Warsito, whose writings are revered not only for its refinement, but even more so for its very material power to effect reality, that is, to make things happen. The Pujongos wrote strategically to produce considered effects in the socio-political milieus in which they composed. They produced texts which were prophetic, not just as records of already determined foreseen futures, but rather as kinds of writing whose very inscription itself could or would materially affect what was to come. Often writing of the very distant past, the Pujongos wrote texts of material prophecy self-consciously to affect the practical and political reality of both their historical presence and the imagined futures. They constructed their texts into contest and transform prior text and context, that is, prior histories, into something quite novel and often yet unknown. The anonymous Babat Joko Tingkir, studied by Nancy Florida, clearly demonstrates this prophetic historiographical operation. Rather than focus on the genetic antecedents of the ruling elite of his present-day Jawa, the anonymous Pujongo wrote in a series of episodes the stories of a handful of peculiar characters on the margins of the dominant literary, historical, and cultural traditions. These episodes are deftly bound together to engender a new historical form, which would emerge through contestation rather than merely descend along royal bloodlines, like, for example, in the Babat Tanah Jawu, right? Describing a new future out of a constructed traditional past, the Babat Joko Tingkir discloses a novel history whose effectiveness is self-consciously projected onto suggested tomorrows. Instead of writing a conventional foundational history of Joko Tingkir, this text invokes the emergence of an alternative future, an alternative Joko Tingkir who might reign not as yet another founding father, but as a sign of empowered margins, as a figure for new forms of politics. Rather than register a recuperation of past reality in the name of objective truth, or a reinscription of the imagined past of dynastic presence with an eye to continuing traditional status quo, the Babat Joko Tingkir constructs an alternative past which, countering its oppressive colonial present, would move towards more autonomous, perhaps even liberating futures. So prophetic historiography releases events from the presumed past of its occurrence into the linguistic, literary, and socio-political cultural structures of its contemporary inscription, its present commemoration in writing, and its future orientation as prophecy. As a mode of construction, the writing releases the event forward in time into the heterogeneous universe of co-textuality and contextuality to be read and realized. Here, the relation among the past events, the historian, and the language through which the historian writes the past are appreciated as more ambiguous. Rather than attempt to recover a really real event in transparent language, texts composed by Pujongos offer glimpses of a past that does not occupy a privileged extra-linguistic position as a really real outside the writing. But Florida notes how this does not suggest that the past event is a mere fictitious construction of the Pujongos. Not at all. Past event is real to the Pujongos and their audience, but its reality is neither absolute nor divorced from the linguistic reality of its writing. After all, this writing of history is not to record the past as such, but to effect an alternative future, right? That's the point. It is a form of active memory that neither ignore discontinuity, say, for example, the rupture of colonial modernity, nor allow forgetting a past, or rather past. This kind of writing provokes a productive intimacy with both past and futures, an intimacy realized in the relay across time, a long prophetic time that the writing has set off. Now, what I found really interesting is that Florida's own reading of the Babat Joko Tingkir is very much engaged in that historiography, compared to, say, other historians of Java who have utilized such sources. I'm thinking about people like Merle Ricklefs, Peter Carey. They only use this text as to reconstruct the past. But Nancy is actually trying to extend the prophetic historiography of a text like Babat Jaka Tingkir. So her reading is a self-conscious extension of the text prophetic script for the future. Her work shows how historians can learn from and extend the prophetic historiography of the Pujongos by maintaining a dialogue between different temporalities. That is, between a Javanese past, a text that inscribes that past, and the alternative futures that the text suggests for the present. This dialogic encounter emerges from the interplay of various subjectivities across time, space, and language, from the particularities of Florida's own personal history and context, that of the New Order Indonesia, and the realities inscribed in the text to the potential readers that work and her own work would address. Florida has shown, I think, a way of writing history that does not simply use indigenous to reconstruct a history of Java, but to engage a particular Javanese text in an extended historical conversation in order to follow up on the text's own prophetic tendencies and to imagine with it a historical space for the future. That's why, for this reason, Nancy Florida's book is not only an important contribution to the historiography of Java, but to historiography in general, because it offers an alternative way of doing history. The point is not to master the Javanese past or a text of that past, but to reinscribe through dialogue the text's apparent future intentions and extend its future intention into a new spatio-temporal context. By having recognized and reinscribed her present as the future that the Pujong prophesied, Florida had revitalized the past and at the same time activated a relay across discontinuous times that can motivate future generations of the Pujongos' ethical and political message. Ini menarik sekali. Jadi Pujonggonya itu menulis di abad 19 tentang masa depan yang akan datang. Nancy Florida menulis di tahun 80, tahun 90-an tentang masa kininya, tapi dia tulis tentang masa kini ini sebagai masa depannya yang diimajinasikan oleh sang Pujonggo. Berarti apa? Merealisasikan nubuatnya, merealisasikan profesinya. Sehingga kemudian tiba-tiba ada temporal connection antara New Order Indonesia dan colonial modernity tanpa harus melewati homogeneous identity. It's absolutely brilliant. Jadi dengan begitu, message politik dan etis dari sang Pujonggo ini kembali menggema. Ya kan? Benar ternyata yang dibilang sama Pujonggo dulu itu. That very reinscription at the same time complicates our singular conception of historical time, precisely by rendering that very time into contestable and generative fields made up of multiple temporalities, where different temporal constructs can coexist and suggest alternative futures informed by the present need and problematics. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by bringing this preliminary exploration to the themes and questions proposed by the organizer of this conference. As I mentioned in the very beginning, the proposition of this conference is that to understand, question, and build future historical alternatives grounded in substantial equality between the East and the West, the South and the North, non-binary, non-linear efforts are needed. Betul ya? Itu. Benar? Okay. Based on this proposition, I have turned to the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss and the historian Dipesh Chakrabarty, both of whom have shown the ideological work of history in projecting and naturalizing the notion of historical time, which have subsumed other forms of human temporalities and helped to enact a chronometric inequality, that is unequal global structure of time based on the binary logic of first in the Occident and followed by the Orient. Sampai-sampai kita ini menganggap waktu yang historis itu ya sangat natural dan apa namanya, dan ya itulah waktu itu seperti itu gitu kan, kronologis, kronosentris. Ini menunjukkan kesuksesan dari proyek ideologis yang kita bisa sebut sebagai sejarah. This notion of historical time is what triggered the theory of progress and development that have remained dominant in post-colonial context. Dan kalau kita nggak punya konstruk waktu yang seperti itu, yang sekarang ini, yang objektif waktu itu ada tanggal segini terus gini terus maju ke depan, maka nggak bakal ada itu teori-teori tentang progres, tentang kemajuan, development dan lain-lain, karena itu semua membutuhkan arsitektur waktunya untuk dia bisa meaningful. One fundamental way to address this problem is by reimagining how we think about time, history, and narrativity. Walter Benjamin and Nancy Florida have shown, and to do this, I turn to the figure of the flaneur and the pujongo. Walter Benjamin and Nancy Florida have shown how their poetic and prophetic gaze can help us envision an alternative historiographical operation, one that is based on active construction as opposed to reconstruction. This historiographical operation destabilizes and opens up the singular and linear historical time to the multiplicity of human temporal imaginaries. Both flaneur and the pujongo begins with the present. Dengan masa kini mereka selalu start. And that present is essentially and fundamentally a political concept, an attitude determined by actual social circumstances. From that very political present, the flaneur and the pujongo perceives the contours of the future, not in what is yet to come, but in the fading light of the past. Jadi mereka mulai dari masa kini, melihat problem dan politik masa kini, dan mereka ingin menulis tentang masa depan yang diinginkan, bukan dengan menceritakan masa depan itu seperti apa, tapi dengan mengkonstruksikan masa lalu yang akan sesuai dengan masa depan yang diharapkan. Jadi dia menulis ke depan dengan melihat ke belakang. They grasp the constellation into which their own present has entered, along with a very specific earlier one, which otherwise is not recognized by the present as one of its own concerns, and thus under threat to disappear irretrievably. For the flaneur and the pujongo, the present is a site of practice and sociality, one that points to temporal endedness, incompletion, and multi-accentuality. It is a present where the past is constantly being reimagined, thereby acknowledging that past and present are not necessarily successive, but are instead simultaneously produced. Such a historiographical operation seeks to locate and recognize the specters of forgotten and defeated past that remain as disquiets in the present, and then construct and activate them. It entails seeing history not from the presumption of a fixed past capable of yielding a historical knowledge, but the assumption about the openness of that past to different possibilities of construction. The poetic and the prophetic are politically and ethically driven historiographical operations that are informed by a realization of the power of imagination, writing, and narrativity in recuperating defeated past and envisioning a different future. In this sense, historiography is no longer simply an informative endeavor. More than that, it becomes a transformative enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Ismail Fajri Alatas. To be honest, I'm not a historian, and then I'm quite struggling a lot. But the idea is interesting. Is a call to read it again reflexively about the history of our time. And I was interesting how to see Rong Marsito ideas. I don't know, is the current generation written Rong Marsito? No, that's the person, but the way he interpreted what happened in the past for the future was interesting. And this is very indigenous local wisdom in Indonesia, but that need more be referenced, read again by the current academia. While others scholars you mentioned about Reclap and James Carroll, that's a different. Okay, we're going to move to the speakers. Sudah siap belum? Bu Lailatul Fitria. Belum? Gimana, Mas?
I'm here.
Oke, Bu Lailatul, sudah siap? Persilahkan. Kita punya masih sekitar about half an hour for your time, please.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I have the share screen function. I think I do. Let me just put on some timer so that I don't take a lot of time to deliver my talk. Oh, I do have the share screen here. Okay. All right. Can everyone confirm whether my screen is can be seen there?
Yeah, it's good. It's good.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Good morning, I guess, from my home office here in Toronto, Canada. My name is Laili, and it is 12 a.m. here, at midnight in Canada. So forgive me if there are any mistakes that's come out of my sluggishness, because this is literally my bedtime. So there is that. The first thing I want to say is a congratulation and also appreciation for the organizer of this conference. I think this is a very important conference with a very significant topic that speak to a lot of important themes that is happening in our lifetime right now. And today I'd like to deliver a talk that I envision this talk as a material for further reflection, right? So I want to talk about challenges for Indonesian universities in a time in our time right now, where it is characterized by several crises that has been going on, also several genocides, ecocides, and all other global scale man-made calamities that has been characterizing our life. And I want to reflect with you all about the place and the role of Indonesian universities and also Indonesian academic communities in this kind of time. All right, so let me just go to my next slide. So before we talk about that, before we talk specifically about what kind of roles and what kind of voices that Indonesian universities can have on global stage in this context, I would like to talk with you about the characterizations that our lifetime has right now. And I want to divide this into three major topics. The first is context, the second is implication, and the third is epistemology. And I'm really glad that the previous two speakers, both Professor Montero and Professor Alatas, has already giving us some foundation to think about how actually coloniality is not only implicating the way we think and the way we live, literally the way of our being, but also the way we see history, and the way we understand how time itself can actually work in our life. And I'm really glad that Professor Alatas has mentioned that, that quote that stays with me, right? Time that is outside hegemonic history, because that is indeed one of the myth of modernity that we need to deconstruct, and then we need to find an alternative narrative place that colonial modernity, right? So talking about modernity and coloniality, I'm reminded by two scholars here, Walter Mignolo and Achille Mbembe, right? So Walter Mignolo says, modernity is a complex narrative whose point of origination was Europe, a narrative that builds Western civilization by celebrating its achievements while hiding at the same time its darker side, coloniality, right? Coloniality, in other words, is constitutive of modernity. There is no modernity without coloniality. And this is not, a thing that only happened in classical colonial time, right? This is also happened right now in our contemporary time. We can see how jarring is the gap of lives that is that in which we can see a genocide going on in our social media, through our phones, right? Something that happened in Gaza, another thing that happened in Sudan and also Congo. But then we, in a relatively safe space in our own locales, continuously working in our daily life, right? I can, in my daily life, I woke up and I made my breakfast while also reading about how many babies that have been killed in a bombing strike in Gaza today, right? So this is what, literally the clearest example of the duality between modernity and coloniality. As a person who live in Canada, as a person who live in a global North country, I am shielded within a very comfortable and privileged, lenses that comes out literally from the historical coloniality and the colonial projects that the country that I'm in right now has been doing for centuries, right? And then that privilege then become contrasted with the facts that I consumed every day through my social media, in which it shows the suffering and the exploitations of so many marginalized groups in Global South that is literally bolstering the comfortable lives of people in the Global North. So this is what the duality between modernity and coloniality means. Achille Mbembe says, the history of modern democracy is at bottom a history with two faces and even two bodies, the solar body on the one hand and the nocturnal body on the other. The major emblems of this nocturnal body are the colonial empire and the pro-slavery state, and more precisely, the plantation and the penal colony, right? So literally speaking, this reminds me of a current debate right now that is going on, especially in the United States, right? Because there is a new presidential candidate from the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris, who is seen as a progressive candidate. However, this progressive candidate is also very much a part of the same system that support and enable the genocide in Gaza, right? So the debate right now is that there are a lot of marginalized groups within the United States that sees, choosing or voting for Kamala Harris is something that needs to be done because their lives will ultimately be worse under the Trump administration. However, some other people within the United States also, also realize that actually Kamala Harris is not that progressive at all. She is also a part of the same colonial and empire project that the United States has been unleashing towards other countries in the Global South, right? So then, the democracy that has been, a fact for many members of society in the United States, it's something that literally is bolstered and supported and actually constructed and created by the elimination of so many global South communities, right? It stands on the blood of Gaza. It stands on the bodies of people who were killed in Iraq. It stands on the victims that were killed in Afghanistan, right? So then the relationship between coloniality and democracy as a product of modernity is something that is intertwined, right? There is no modernity without coloniality. And so all of the myths that is related with modernity, right, that is I mentioned here in my slide: civilization, productivity, progress, which Professor Alatas specifically criticized there, ownership, heterosexuality, independence, peace, and democracy. All of those are actually the solar body, the solar face of the dark reality that so many marginalized communities in Global South still living in up to today, right? So next is the implication. What is the implication of this, intertwining relationship between modernity and coloniality? So there's something called the disposables, right? So the disposables is basically these groups of human who are by virtue of their social, political, economic, gender, race, religion, position, they were classified as people who can be disposed, people who can be replaced by others, right? And again, Bembe here argues that this is one of the implications of the nocturnal phase of democracy. Zygmunt Bauman, in his book, talk about these disposables as the human ways of modern design. So the idea is that one of the things about modernity is its myth of progress, right? And what is progress without creating something new? Progress is the demand of creating new things again and again and again. And when you're creating new things, when you're consuming new things, you are producing waste, right? And this is exactly the logic of modern society in which we are living in right now. We are not only producing the waste that we consumed, like our old clothes or our old phones, we are also producing human waste. We are producing the disposables, those who are the excess of society, whose presence deemed threatening towards the sustainability of the modern order. So Mignola says that the disposables are the results of modern economy. In one of my research, I work with Indonesian female migrant workers who work in Singapore, for example, and I'm compiling their life narratives, especially in relation to their theologies, their living theologies, and also their religiosities. And the various amounts of stories of abuse and exploitations that I heard from them, that is exactly the examples of this, right? It is the example of the results of modern economy. Those people, the female migrant workers that I've worked with, they are the ones who, by virtue of their gender, their socioeconomic classes, and also the colonial process that is going on in our country and in Singapore, right? It situates them to be the disposables. And then it is justified by modern epistemology, right? This classification between those who are disposable and those who are not disposables. There is a certain epistemology that is behind it. Professor Alatas has been saying about the historical epistemology of it, which is, they are the one who are being designed as people without history. But then I will also talk about the sociological epistemology that can actually justify this classification in my next slide. So there's this interesting quote from Mbembe here. The disposables, let me just move my screen so that I can read it. The disposables as terrifying objects, right? That's what Mbembe's words is for the disposables. They are the terrifying objects for the modern society. So a separation wall is supposed to resolve a problem of excess of presence, the very presence that some see as the origin of situations of unbearable suffering. To regain the feeling of existing henceforth depends on breaking with that excess presence, whose absence or indeed disappearance, pure and simple, will by no means be felt as a loss. This also means accepting that there is nothing common to be shared between us and them. The anxiety of annihilation thus goes to the core of contemporary projects of separation. So Mbembe see modern society as a society of separation. It's a society that's separated by these two classifications between those who are deemed as disposables and those who are deemed as non-disposables. Those who are deemed as disposables usually are being separated by a wall. It can be a physical wall. We can talk about the southern border wall in the United States between the United States and Mexico. That's a physical wall. We can talk about the physical wall in Gaza, which is a part of the apartheid project of the Israeli occupation system. But we can also talk about a more systemic wall, like the prison industry in the United States, for example, which incarcerated a lot of Black and brown men every year, right? So the prison industry in the United States is a very clear example of this separation, of this project of separation. Those are the disposables people whose presence have been rejected by the society, and whose welfare and whose life is not the concern of the society because they have been deemed disposable. So they are basically being placed in a camp, right? Which is this prison, right? So this is the implication of that modern logic, because we are constantly working on a progress, constantly creating something new. Then we are producing waste, and one of the waste that we're producing is these disposables. Now, what is the epistemology behind it? What is it that justify that kind of classification within our society? So I want to talk about patriarchy here, patriarchy as coloniality. And the idea here is inspired by Imani Perry in her books Faxi Thing, right? So Imani Perry basically theorized that there are three systems that actually supported the practice, the embodiment, and the ideology of patriarchy. And they are property, sovereignty, and personhood, right? And all of this, of course, can be traced back to the project of settler colonialism, both in the United States and also in Canada, right? Because that's where the context of the book that Imani Perry has written. So property, the permission to have ownership towards something or someone, right, that is given by the sovereign political regime to a person, that is a membership of, a sign of membership in a political society. So someone is a legal subject when he has property, right? When he can actually own things, when he has actually belongings. And these belongings is not only things, right? It is also humans. And especially in the settler colonial projects, it's slaves, right? And also it is covering also his dominion of his liege, namely his women and children. And then sovereignty is something that comes out of the fact that he can actually own something. When he owns something, or when he owns someone, he actually have power to distribute life or death toward those things or toward those people, right? So this is sovereignty. So sovereignty is basically the distribution of death and the distribution of life, right? Now, when you have this as a subject, when you have property, and because you have property, you have sovereignty, then you have personhood. You are actually counted as a legal subject in front of the state. Without these two, you are non-persons. You are outside of the legal regime. You are outside of the protection of the state, right? So the epistemology is rooted in this doctrine of personhood as colonial classification. It's the classification is three, right? The patriarch, the person who have property and have sovereignty, and those have full personhood. And then his liege, right? The women and children, they're probably, half person because they're not slaves, but they're also not men. So they're not really full, human beings, not full legal person. And then the non-persons, the indigenous peoples, right? The slaves, the people of colors, the colonized people. So all of those are non-persons. They cannot actually enter into the social and political community. Now, Perry said that the status of the legal person has always been structurally distinct from the fact of being a human being. So being a legal person is not about being a human being, because if it is only about being a human being, then all of us are human being. But legal person is a very exclusive status, it's a very colonial status that actually says, right, that actually says that the one who can actually have protection and rights are literally men, and not only men, white men, and not only white men, white European Christian men, right? So that is the legal person in this conception. And now we see how this create the classification of the disposables and the non-disposables, right? Those who are in this category or who are adjacent to this category, those who are adjacent to whiteness, those who are adjacent to being a rational man, those who are adjacent to the elite power of capitalism, like all of these groups are, of course, the non-disposables people. But others than that, they are the disposables, right? So this is the sociological epistemology behind the classification of disposables and non-disposables. Oops. All right, so now let's talk about temporality. This is just my argument, seeing the dynamic of modernity / coloniality, and the ways the logic of modernity and coloniality produce the disposables. So basically, in many ways, the past is in the present, and then that shape the future, right? So the difference is that globalization and the myth of progress bring colonial violence back to the metropoles, while the undesirables or the disposables are close at home. So that is what is very much characteristically different about our time, right? Because in the classical colonial time, all of these people who are deemed as the disposables, they would be, thrown out literally to the colonies, right? They would be sent out from the Netherlands, from the UK to their colonies, because they are the disposables. But now, within the context of globalization, the disposables, the undesirables, are also close at home. Think about the tent city in Los Angeles, for example, people who are unhoused, right? And like I mentioned before, people who are in the prison industry and being incarcerated in the United States, those are the disposables who live in the colonial center, who live within the empire, right? And this can bring some negative and also positive implications. So the negative implication with that is that because the disposables is close to us, then there's the heightening of annihilation anxiety, right? So it means that people who are with power, people who are at the elite hierarchical position in the society, they entrench themselves because they are being threatened by the presence of the disposables within their midst, right? So we can see this in the entrenchment of colonial powers, by means of capitalistic exploitations, right? By means of genocides and by means of ecocide. Every day, there is something that is worse happening around the world, either in terms of war, in terms of genocides, in terms of environmental destruction, right? Our own government in Indonesia is not really, shame anymore about burning down our forests, right? So all of those are expression of the entrenchment of colonial powers because the disposables are close at home, right? So the other is actually something that cannot be separated from the self anymore, even though that's always has been a myth, right? But right now, like, the chicken come to roost, as if I need to use an expression to say that. But that's not only the only implication. There is also a positive implication of this, which is the creation of creative spaces that produce subaltern knowledges and forms of authorities, right? Imagine, just think about, the various communities that the Indonesian university students have right now. A lot of discussions that I see happening in social media about a lot of important topics. There are a lot of critics towards the neoliberal logic of our government, for example, that is happening in social media. A lot of student movement and a lot of protests that this has been happening. North America and Europe, just recently witnessing the power of student protests against the genocide in Gaza, right? Which is also actually being repressed violently by the state and the police, which is, again, back to that, the hastening of annihilation anxiety, right? There is always spaces, there is always creativity, there is always alternative narratives that grow out of this. And I think this is an implication of the growth of multiple futures, right? So we don't only talk about the linear neoliberal logic of future right now. We don't talk about this in terms of development of progress. We talk about multiple decolonial futures that can come out of these communities. So now within all of those systemic, logic of modernity / coloniality and the ways the colonial powers has entrenched their oppression over marginalized communities around the world, then what to do, right? What is it that the Indonesian universities and Indonesian academic communities in general have to take as steps in facing this? I only highlighted 4 points here, but of course, this is not an exhaustive list. But I think this is the most important one. The first is that Indonesian universities needs to be a space where critical awareness of knowledge production as a political activity needs to grow, right? So we cannot afford anymore to say as an academics that our work, our teaching, our research is politically neutral, right? No. There is no politically neutral knowledge production. Knowledge production has always been a political activity, as has been argued by many decolonial scholars, right? So then, if knowledge production is a very political activity, then of course we need to take sides, right? Because then there is no objective position. We cannot just be a value free observer that only observes something within the interests of our academic research, right? So then if we need to take sides of the marginalized, right? In terms of Indonesian universities, take sides of the communities who are right now being oppressed systematically and whose land being grabbed systematically for the interest of mining industries, right? Stand with them. use our knowledge to defend them and defend their interests, because they are also the one who actually keep our environment, right? They are the stewards of our environment. Stand with the masyarakat adat, right? Stand with the indigenous peoples. Stand with the West Papuans, right? Stand with the queer communities, right? So those are the marginalized communities that we need to highlight and we need to put up front in our knowledge production activity. And then the third point is academic communities needs to develop skills to critically analyze intertwined oppressions and forms of hegemonic power. So do not only scratch the surface of our research topic, right? For example, one topic that is my pet peeves, right? Because I'm also doing some kind of, in Islamic studies. And one topic that has been going out of Indonesian scholarly community that has been my pet peeve is the topic about Islamic radicalization, right? And there are a lot of papers that has been written about Islamic radicalization without necessarily questioning the narrative of Islamic radicalization. What is wrong with that? Kind of Orientalist paradigm that is in it, what kind of neoliberal logic that works in it, what kind of imperial interest that is in it, right? That is the important things that need to be questioned, right? So don't just scratch the surface, try to question the logic of that topic, right? So that's the third point. And the last point is abolishing feudalism, patriarchy, colonial warships, and other forms of hierarchical relations in higher educations. We have, the Indonesian academic community has been having this, bad days, right, for this past a few weeks due to a lot of news that comes out of that has been exposing how corrupt and how brittle the integrity of academic structure in Indonesia is, right? How easy it is for people to be guru besar, for example, without having any qualification about it just because of their seniority, right? So that kind of thing, right? That is coloniality. That is colonial logic. That is feudalism. That is patriarchy. That needs to be questioned. That needs to be deconstructed. And also about colonial warships, right? I'm just gonna mention here that I'm an Indonesian. Most of the audience here is Indonesian, but then again, because this is an international conference supposed to be in English. So here I am speaking in my fifth language instead of in my native language of Indonesia, which other peoples are also speaking within here. So that is also a form of colonial worship that we need to deconstruct, that we need to question here. So last but not least, revolution is now, ladies and gentlemen. We cannot postpone this. We cannot, just debating about decolonization as a metaphor, right? We cannot just, talk about decolonization as a conference theme, because as Eve Tak and Wayne Yang has written in their very, very important article, decolonization is not a metaphor. It is an action, and it is a real action. It is a political action. And we need to do this together as a global South community. So that's all my talk. Thank you everyone for listening to me.
Okay, thank you, Bu Lailatul Fitria. I thought you were in Indonesia at the moment, so I'm sorry. Now it's already midnight, or just a couple of minutes before midnight. Okay, and thank you for the very interesting presentation. That's the decolonization. It's not just a topic. It's a real project in academic. And now in the current situation in Indonesian academia, that is becoming more important because the mainstream, the current hegemony, not only in politics, not only in the scholarship, this is very strong legacy of the colonialism. So, and then I'm going to invite the question for the audience. So please, we have a three for the first term, and then please Bu Marit and Pak Fajri to stand in front. Please, we have a question about the topic. That's yeah, to be honest, it's a very hard topic. Very please. Yeah. A question? Yeah, Miss Bu dari Mbak Yuyun. And bisa dibantu Mas? No, it's just minta ini ya, tak tolong mikrofon, mic-nya. Ya. Oh, oh yeah, I can use that. Thank anyway. Oh, they have that. Okay, please.
Thank you, Pak. Thank you so much, Professor Marit, Bib Aji, and Mbak Lelio, and of course, our dear moderator, Pak Amika. Indeed, we have a very, thought-provoking discussions today, the debates, the discussions on very real issues on the ground. I mean, we have lived and we are living in these situations today. My first question, I would address this to Ibu Marit. I am so much interested in the idea of patriarchy, childhood, and motherhood in your research. I mean, do you see whether women's and gender issues in this colonial context is also a pressing issues in your research, and how do you address that issues? I think that is my question, Professor Marit, and thank you for your kind, explanations on the issues that you're raising on in this conference. And Habib Aji and Mbak Laili, it is really also very interesting and important subjects that you raised in this conference. And of course, I love both of your presentations. My question to you, Habib Aji, is that are we still living the ways in which scholars and poets in their prophecy today? I mean, how is it that we are living now in our situation today, especially in this very latest era of Bapak Jokowi? How do you reason that past with our temporal today? So that's my question. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Then, in other words, there is any, please. Yeah, Pak. Silakan.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm quite happy that all of the speakers providing us with many insights. The idea about this conference about rating on temporality of Orientalism and Occidentalism. And I just think about how the reflexivity that happens in discussions, and then it goes to dialogue from the past to the now, and how to see the future then. But the case is past, now, and future is in different time of period. Past, now, and future is a different time of period, and different time of period, because it's a past, future, and now and future. And the case is how to confirm the issue, to confirm the finding that, as you said before, and then how to make it a dialogue. Because as said by Buleli, the patriarchy is about a man, white man, and European white man. And in the idea of the discussion of Prof. Aji, it said about the case is in Asia, in the Oriental situation, but mostly discussed with people in European. How to make a dialogue on it, on interact with, because the issue is about rethinking it, not only providing the Orientalism or Occidentalism itself. including the way Prof. Mari explained about the issue on child separation, how to make a dialogue, how to discuss it from what the finding you got, and how to confirm that that's the situation happening in the past, and then we can confirm in this time. That's my thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then I think just let provide you to answer the question, and then we'll read after that. Yeah, please.
Hello? Yeah. Thank you for the question. Should I respond in English or Indonesian? Indonesian is fine, ya. Oke. Terima kasih ya pertanyaannya Mbak Yuyun dan Pak. Linking the past and the present today. Nah, ini saya pikir kenapa tadi apa namanya presentasi dari Profesor Fitri ya Kak Laili ini penting karena tadi yang saya dengar dari presentasi itu adalah pentingnya untuk take a side, kan? Jadi kalau misalnya ditanya bagaimana kita melink past and present today and the future today, ya selalu yang saya pelajari baik misalnya dari imajinasi sejarahnya yang digagas oleh atau yang diimajinasikan oleh The Figure of the Flaneur sama Pujonggo itu, keduanya dia selalu memulai dari masa kini dan apa yang dia lihat di masa kini yang mengusik dia. Dan baru apa yang mengusik dia di masa kini itulah dia mencari, dia melihat ke belakang, ya kan? Melihat ke masa lalu yang terkadang sudah disisihkan dari narasi nasional, dari historiografi modern, cerita-cerita tentang marginal figures dan lain-lain, dan kemudian mengkonstruksikan sebuah narasi yang bermula dari masa kini ke masa depan untuk menyongsong masa depan yang lebih cerah. Sebagai contoh misalnya, kita lihat kita sekarang hidup di zaman di mana telah terjadi sebuah proses pemindahan ibu kota, ya kan? Misalnya, ini nggak ini direkam, ya tapi ini direkam. Oh ya udah nggak jadi. Apa namanya? Ya, apapun tadi misalnya kasus Kendeng, kasus apa saja itu sebenarnya bisa menjadi point of departure pada saat kita mengkonstruksikan masa lalu dan relasinya dengan masa kini. Yang dibutuhkan adalah sebuah imajinasi, makanya saya sebut baik di dalam poetic historiografi dan prophetic historiografi itu sejarah itu menjadi sebuah proyek konstruksi naratif dan bukan sebagai rekonstruksi. Karena justru sejarawan itu, baik Pujonggo maupun yang digagas oleh Walter Benjamin itu, dia membangun sebuah narasi yang tidak berbasis pada sebuah causal connection, kausalitas seperti dalam sejarah yang konvensional, tetapi justru merangkai sebuah cerita karena memang tujuan dari penulisan sejarah itu bukan merekuperasi, mencoba menghadirkan kembali masa lalu yang sudah hilang, seakan-akan memang masa lalu itu bisa dihadirkan kembali, tapi memang proyeknya adalah sebuah ethical project dan political project untuk menyongsong masa depan yang lebih baik. Dan di zaman ini terlalu banyak hal-hal yang menyebabkan kita memunculkan disquiet, memunculkan ketidaksukaan kita baik secara political reason ataupun ethical reason. Tadi Profesor Fitria sudah banyak bahas hal itu. Nah, itu seharusnya menjadi invitation dan provocation untuk kita mengkonstruk narasi. Karena seperti tadi dikatakan oleh Profesor Fitria, bukan hanya tadi the need to take side, tetapi juga pentingnya bahwa decolonization ini bukan hanya metafor. Dan saya melihat salah satu praksis yang sangat penting dan juga dibutuhkan itu bukan hanya demo-demo dan lain-lain itu, tetapi juga konstruksi narasi. Karena bagaimana Anda mau membangun ini semua, membuat sebuah political transformation pada saat zaman kita ini adalah zaman yang miskin narasi dan miskin, kita nggak tahu mau melangkah kemana juga, problemnya apa, bagaimana mencoba melangkahnya. Nah, disinilah sejarah memainkan peran penting. Sejarah dulu dijadikan sebuah alat untuk membangun kesadaran kebangsaan, kenapa tidak bisa sejarah kita gunakan sebagai alat etika dan mode etis dan mode politis untuk membangun argumen untuk masa depan. Dan salah satunya yang penting di sini adalah tidak lagi melihat, dan ini ke pertanyaan yang kedua, tidak lagi membayangkan seakan-akan ada masa lalu, masa kini, dan masa depan. Karena ini adalah apa yang disebut sebagai spasialisasi waktu. Dan ini salah satu salah satu ideologi yang dibangun oleh sejarah sebagai sebuah proyek ideologis adalah seakan-akan ada masa lalu, dan masa lalu itu sudah selesai. Sekarang ini kita masa kini dan masa depan yang belum ada. Ini kan satu-satunya cara untuk memahami waktu. Waktu itu sangat fluid. Tetapi yang diimajinasikan oleh disiplin sejarah modern adalah waktu itu seakan-akan terspasialisasi. Itu kan logika ruang, bukan logika waktu yang ada batas-batasnya. Terkadang apa-apa yang harusnya diberangus sudah menjadi bagian dari masa lalu masih ada kok di masa kini. Tadi Profesor Monteiro berbicara banyak tentang bagaimana the colonial remains. Ya kan, praktik-praktik kolonial itu masih ada dan masih hidup di zaman postkolonial. Artinya the whole logic of post-coloniality itu kan berarti kan menyadarkan kita bahwa bayang-bayang kolonialisme itu belum selesai. Walaupun misalnya proyek nasionalisme mengatakan kita sudah merdeka, tapi kan ternyata logika-logika dan praktik-praktik kolonialisme itu masih ada. Nah, itu kan sebenarnya meluluhlantahkan narasi-narasi yang menganggap bahwa ada zaman kolonial, ada zaman postkolonial dan lain-lain. Ini kan sebenarnya hanya bikinan saja, tapi waktu-waktunya praktiknya mungkin di saat ada praktik-praktik yang memang kita sudah betul-betul dalam tanda kutip postkolonial, tapi masih banyak sekali yang juga kita sebenarnya masih di dalam skema kolonial. Jadi itu juga yang saya pikir sangat penting, bahwa kronologi dan kronometris itu kita harus pahami sebagai sebuah heuristik saja untuk para sejarawan itu membangun sebuah cerita, tapi waktu itu nggak harus seperti itu loh. Dan kita harus berani ya sebagai sejarawan, antropolog atau social scientist untuk belajar misalnya dari kesusastraan, dari kesenian tentang cara-cara membangun narasi politik dan narasi etika, atau menulis sejarah atau menulis antropologi yang cukup berbeda, yang tidak hanya harus terpaku pada hal-hal yang bersifat suksesi dan lain. Nah, ini saya pikir penting untuk kita lakukan, dan itu challenge-nya di situ. Dan saya belajar banyak dari both Flanner dan Pujogo sebagai cara kita menulis sejarah yang tidak lagi hanya rekonstruktif, tetapi justru sebagai sebuah konstruksi, sebuah praksis etika, praksis moral, dan praksis politik juga. Dan dilepas narasi yang kita bangun itu di sebuah contested field, biar dia berkontestasi. Kita juga tidak mengatakan ini yang paling benar juga, gitu. Tapi itu adalah menjadi sebuah bagian dari kontestasi wacana yang ada. Tapi penting sekali narasi, penulisan sejarah itu saya pikir yang tidak lagi tunduk kepada struktur-struktur yang selama ini dipakemkan. Itu saya pikir penting sebagai sebuah political experimentation. Apalagi sekarang di zaman social media dan lain-lain, media forms-nya juga sudah banyak sekali yang bisa digunakan untuk mengimajinasikan struktur waktu yang mungkin berbeda dari apa yang selama ini kita paham.
Terima kasih. Thank you. Bu Marit, can respond?
Can I do it in English? Okay. Thank you for your question. I rephrased because it's now about 10 minutes ago that you posted. So just that I'm sure that I'm sure what you asked me. And I think you asked me how gender and notions such as patriarchy and matriarchy play out in our project that is focused on child separation, on children that are raised outside of their families, separated from their kin and communities. Is that the question?
Yes, with the emphasis of, feminist motherhood. The ideas of motherhood is on the sides of women. Parenthood is motherhood.
In Indonesia, parenthood is motherhood. In the Netherlands, that's not the case. And in Indonesia, I believe in the future that will not be the case either. If we take up all the advice of the colleague who spoke last and who urges us to decolonize society and to be aware of existing relations in society, and that also pertains, I think, to the most intimate relations that we know within the family. And these relations need to be decolonized as well. So you cannot talk about parenting skills and then offer courses for mothers, which is what happens here, to my amazement. Okay, but our cultures are very different, and what we're doing in the project goes to the heart of gender. But gender is not a stable category. Gender is a concept that helps us understand how relations are structured on the basis of conceptions, cultural and social conceptions of masculinity, femininity, and by now all sorts of categories in between and beyond those core categories. So how are these categories conceived culturally and socially? So the gender is in no way stable. So through the lens of child separation, we are able to look at kinship structures, community structures, conceptions of what is a child, when does a child cease to be a child, at what age or what actions, what does a child need according to faith-based organizations? That is not stable. And it's not the same for a child, a pupil of a Muhammadiyah orphanage, than for a pupil in a Catholic orphanage, say in the Panti Asuhan Santa Maria in Ganjuran. It's not the same. So it's not a stable category. So really, and patriarchy and matriarchy, for our empirical research, these are too big. These terms are too big. They're not refined enough for us to understand what's happening on the ground. And we really want to know what's happening on the ground and how conceptions of good motherhood are connected to conceptions of colonial rule. So why are children taken away from their Japanese mothers? Because these mothers are not fit to raise their children. These children should be raised into European norms, and they're better off in an institution than with their mother in the desa or in the kampong. Assessments like that lead us to help us understand, help us analyze the core mechanisms of colonialism, of colonial rule, of differences made between men, women, children, Europeans, Indonesians, foreign Orientals, as the Chinese and the Japanese were called under Dutch colonial law. So it is about, in the project, we use gender as a concept which helps us to understand mechanisms on the ground, colonial mechanisms on the ground. And patriarchy and matriarchy is important. For instance, when we look at local kinship structures, because we do find that in everything the Dutch do here or offer here with very much benevolence, but nevertheless very colonizing benevolence, all that challenges, undermines, disqualifies already existing kinship structures, forms of alternative care for children. So that is what I can say about this, but I don't know if that is an answer to your question. It is? I'm happy. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Mantiro. And there is no specific question for Bu Lailatul Fitriyah, but if you have something to say about what about the occasion, about the topic from Prof. Fajri and Bu Mantiro, please.
Ya, bisa pakai bahasa Indonesia nggak?
Ya, boleh,
Atau
silakan.
Oke. Jadi gini, ngikutin dari argumentasinya Prof. Aji tadi, saya pikir satu hal yang menjadi masalah utama dalam masyarakat yang masih terjebak dalam kolonialitas itu adalah ketidakmampuan untuk melihat bentuk-bentuk otoritas yang alternatif gitu ya, bentuk-bentuk kewenangan yang alternatif gitu. Karena kalau kita bicara soal imajinasi, kalau dikatakan kita itu miskin imajinasi, kita tidak bisa berimajinasi soal apa namanya alternatif masa depan yang lebih baik dan sebagainya, tidak juga kok gitu. Saya banyak bekerja dengan kawan-kawan komunitas feminis misalnya di Indonesia dan juga kawan-kawan komunitas korban tambang misalnya di Indonesia. Dan mereka itu banyak sekali memiliki kekayaan imajinasi tentang apa seharusnya yang menjadi masa depan kita secara etis, secara politis, secara sosial, secara inklusif gender gitu. Jadi suara-suara itu sudah ada kok gitu. Suara-suara alternatif itu sudah ada. Tapi biasanya suara-suara alternatif itu ada di luar komunitas yang hegemon gitu. Kita kan terbiasa untuk mendengarkan orang-orang yang ya kalau nggak otoritas agama gitu ya, otoritas pemerintah atau otoritas akademis ya, orang-orang seperti saya ini gitu ya. Kalau udah profesor ya udah pasti didengerin gitu kan. Tapi padahal pelajaran-pelajaran soal etika masa depan, soal bagaimana kita bisa hidup dengan being dekolonial ya, itu banyak diambil dari otoritas-otoritas di luar struktur yang konvensional itu, di luar struktur kelembagaan itu, gitu. Jadi apa yang harus kita lakukan? Lagi-lagi saya penekanannya dalam apa namanya talk saya ini adalah soal praksis gitu ya. Apa yang harus kita lakukan sebagai komunitas, sebagai bangsa itu untuk melihat kepada bentuk-bentuk kewenangan alternatif ini. Kita harus mendengarkan komunitas-komunitas korban tambang. Kita harus mendengarkan komunitas-komunitas feminis. Kita harus mendengarkan komunitas-komunitas kawan-kawan trans misalnya. Itu disitulah apa etika politik dan praksis sosial dekolonial berada gitu. Disitulah kita bisa belajar. Jadi kalau menurut saya yang harus kita lakukan, kita harus melihat keluar dari kelembagaan. Kita harus melihat keluar dari kelembagaan agama. Kita harus melihat keluar dari kelembagaan universitas. Kita harus melihat keluar dari kelembagaan negara. Karena disitulah visi-visi masa depan kita muncul gitu. Karena memang kreativitas itu kan seperti yang dikatakan oleh Gloria Anzaldúa ya. Kreativitas itu selalu muncul dari wilayah-wilayah perbatasan. Wilayah perbatasan artinya wilayah-wilayah pinggiran dari kelompok-kelompok marginal. Kenapa kreativitas selalu muncul dari kelompok-kelompok marginal? Karena biasanya orang-orang yang di tengah, orang-orang yang di center, orang-orang yang punya kuasa, mereka tidak punya interest untuk merubah status quo gitu kan. Yang punya interest untuk merubah status quo adalah mereka yang menjadi korban dan objek dari opresi itu sendiri gitu. Jadi gitu sih kalau menurut saya, bukannya kita tidak bisa apa namanya mengembangkan narasi alternatif untuk etika masa depan, tapi kita tidak mendengarkan orang-orang yang sudah mengembangkan narasi alternatif untuk masa depan itu. Gitu Mas kira-kira.
Thank you. Terima kasih Bu Fitriyah. And if there are any question from the audience, so please. Also from Zoom, from the online participant, if there are any question? That's a lot. I just realized that. I don't know that. I think that's enough. Okay, thank you very much for all the speakers. That's interesting topic, and I'm sorry, I'm to be honest, I'm not a historian. I'm very challenging with this very interesting topic, and the end is just a call. It's a call. First, history is very interesting. I start with a quote from Karl Marx about that the current, present, and the futures is always haunted by what happened in the past. And then I will be close this section with another quote from Karl Marx in the 11th thesis of Feuerbach. The philosopher have only interested in the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So I will again from Fajri, but to take side. That's our responsibility to take side and then to focus on our work as academia to the topic, then we will make a betterment of the world. Thank you very much for all speaker and after this there is a token presentation of token appreciation from Vice Dean. So how to do that? That is for me. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Baru sadar ya. Tadi baru sadar mau ngomong PKN. Tapi saya pengen dengar dari Ustaz.
Ladies and gentlemen, and we are going to have a break for the lunch and start again at what time? 1 o'clock? Yeah, at 1 o'clock. Thank you very much. Please.
Halo, selamat siang. Untuk peserta mahasiswa nanti dipersilahkan kita ke sini lagi pukul 1 ya. 1 siang, sholat mungkin bisa di sekitar sini, nggak usah jauh-jauh. Nanti supaya bisa ikut di sesi berikutnya, nanti akan ada 3 pembicara lagi. Untuk itu saya ucapkan terima kasih. Untuk mahasiswa sekali lagi silahkan mengisi link scan ya untuk partisipan di depan sudah disediakan panitia. Terima kasih.